So very excited for this one. Interestingly, too, you two used to work together. So John is a facade guy on the general contracting side, and Dan is a facade guy on the subcontracting side. But I think before we get into that, I think it'll be fun or insightful to share a little bit about what your working experience was like together.
You want to take this one, Dan, or?
Yeah, I can kick it off a little bit here. So,
Yeah.
Way back when, I think going on here, maybe for me personally, it's been 5 years since I was at Kraus-Anderson, and at that time there, I was there in total for about 5 years and worked heavily out of the Rochester, Minnesota office. Did a lot of K-12 education projects and some public work that we did pick up in town. And my experience or past working experience with John was heavily on the internal QA QC and the services that were put together specifically within that group and what John represents for that entire company there. Very heavily on helping project teams identify the nitty-gritty of the details that fall into the projects and make sure that everybody's looking at it with a microscope for that. So, John, anything more that you would add that I might have missed there?
I think you covered it pretty well. I mean, my engagement is quite often in the constructability review side. Sometimes I'm also trying to bring some let's minimize buyer's remorse and regret on the side of the owner after the project is turned over. So, yeah, it was a great working relationship when we worked at the same place, and it continues to be one now that we have this relationship with between a construction manager and a facade provider.
So has it always been part of the Kraus-Anderson culture to be very facade oriented or focused? And when I say very, maybe we're looking at the team right now. But it's I find it becoming more and more common for large construction managers or general contractors to have a facade specialist and even to have facade oriented superintendents, especially on maybe large unitized jobs. But at the same token, I am finding the industry becoming more heavily reliant on subcontractors and even facade consultants for driving facade decisions. So how do you kind of differentiate between sort of that Kraus-Anderson culture and sort of where the industry is headed?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess I would make a distinction. I don't consider myself a facade guy per se, as much as a enclosure guy. And maybe we can chat a little bit about is there really a difference or not. But I think first and foremost, I'm looking at the control layers of the enclosure, and trying to get that management of water, air, thermal, vapor. I can provide input into the aesthetics of the cladding, but that's probably not my first and foremost.
When I said facade guy, I guess I discern, well, there's a facade and then there's a roof, which
Mm-hmm.
you can have your below grade and above grade roofing. But once you get past those, 5 or 6 walls, it's, I guess, considered the enclosure. But we don't need to focus on aesthetics for right now until we get to Dan. I just mean performance wise as a facade guy.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really, it's kind of a both and, getting back to the original question. It's both providing that focus from the construction manager's side, and it's also, relying heavily on our trade partners, because the construction manager, is not actually performing and implementing the actual work with labor per se, when it comes to, both fabricating and installing the facade. But we need to also have some level of expertise and ability to, guide the conversation, during design, during procurement, and then during construction. So, I do see from my perspective, I see a lot of general contractors and construction managers providing a more broad quality assurance, quality control service, but not necessarily, a high degree of focus exclusively on the enclosure itself.
And Dan, what, as a unitizer yourself, what do you see? Do you see construction managers and general contractors relying on you more, and maybe a receptiveness or appreciation in relying on one subcontractor versus marrying those 3 or 4 trade partners together?
Yeah, no, great question in general there. And I'll say that the trend that we are seeing in the regions that we serve as a company is more like what John and his group are doing at Kraus-Anderson. There are general contractors, construction managers that are starting to implement and create a dedicated building science group that oversees their projects. Whether it's a simple addition or it's a $100 million development, it doesn't matter. They get the same treatment as it relates to building science. But that is becoming more prevalent in the markets that we're in. I will say more so in the Midwest. As we go a little bit further and go a little bit west, it's starting to be more of a newer trend. It's not as historically has not been there as much as what it has been in our other regions that we serve. But when we do get engaged with the teams, it's a different atmosphere. It's a different relationship. You definitely, as a trade partner and a prefabricator, you definitely have a seat at the table and a voice at the table where John and his team, the architects, the facade consultants, they are really putting a lot more trust and ownership into the trade partners to bring and identify the risk or the concerns of the build of what the project team is trying to do, and really, say, hey, where does your product perform the best? Where are the risks? What do we need to understand? And how do we work within the guardrails of your system to make sure that we are doing what the product is intended to do? And to keep going on this here a little bit more is that when we first started this avenue, normally you would have a room full of 5, 6, 7 different trade partners, all having their hands into the design or into completing that facade. And as we continue to engage in more and more projects, that audience continues to shrink, especially with the offerings of prefabrication and Wells in general, offering additional scope that is done at our factories versus on the job site.
So now I want to bring up a harsh reality or ugly truth of the industry at the moment. So, and I'm going to point this to John. How do you manage a successful early SD, DD phase in getting you to the right place or position to get to your GMP and award the job, and then the inherent ugly VE process of what's inevitably coming on all these jobs and having to manage not losing sight or track of what it is that you were trying to achieve?
Wow. Well, I think that was actually like 6 or 7 questions, maybe.
Pick which one you want to answer.
Okay, I'm gonna just I'll bring up a couple thoughts, and these are things that a lot of people talk about all the time, so it's not really new or surprising. It's you have to understand who is vested in the design intent. If it's, I'm just going to be completely honest here. If a party involved in the design is at the end of the day not getting the owner invested in the design intent, then that element or component is probably going to end up on the chopping block if there are budget struggles, right? So that kind of gets back to basis of design, really. So we all talk about basis of design. We love using these terms, but it seems pretty straightforward. Like you have to establish this in the owner's requirements, and the basis of design has to be something that the owner is holding as, I'm not going to let this thing end up on the chopping block. The other piece of it is more and more often it is really critical and important to get your partners on board as soon as possible, through either a design assist process or some other contracting mechanism whereby you can get them providing you with relevant and necessary information early on in the design. So some of these project delivery methods like hard bid GC, it doesn't work. You can't do it that way. You have to have partners on board early. You have to be listening to them, getting their input, and you have to follow through with it. So I don't know, did I answer 2 of the 7 questions, or maybe 1.5?
No, you got there. And where I was going, another thought that came off that is, does it also kind of depend on the client? I mean, and from the owner's standpoint, in theory, in the perfect picture, you have all your trade partners, you meet the design intent, it's a successful project, everybody's happy. But there are going to be projects where you have owners that do want to hard bid. You probably do have to find yourself in that tough situation, managing those details and making sure they're executed on the construction site. So we could paint this perfect picture, but what you're describing almost seems like sort of, the 1 out of 2 out of, or 3 out of 10, perfect scenario projects. But what I try to sort of bring back on a lot of these discussions on this podcast is, the perfect scenario that we dream up versus the reality of how buildings are getting built today. And probably 90+% of the people I've had on here are from the design community, and we haven't had many from the construction site. So that's why I'm trying to focus a little more on what's actually getting built today, and harsh realities that are coming up in the field. I hear of or see projects where they don't even have a glazing sub on site. They have their drywall sub or somebody plopping in the windows, and I don't know who takes ownership or responsibility of those details. So I know that was a little bit of a long-winded rant, but yeah, you guys can respond to that.
I don't know. You wanna take a swing, Dan, or I can keep on babbling here. Either way.
Why don't you go first, John, and then I'll jump in here with a couple comments.
So I think one component, which is another thing we talk about quite often, which is plugged in and is a consideration, is really what is the client's preferred style of total cost of ownership for the project. And by that I mean, the kind of the stereotypical example is like if it's a developer that is planning on, building a project and getting it leased out and then selling it, their priorities are going to be different from, another client who perhaps might be holding that building for 20+ years, or, municipal or university higher ed, they might be holding it for hundreds of years. So you kind of have to plug in that owner's style of preferred spend, really, in terms of what are they trying to achieve, what are they trying to get a return on for that project. In terms of the trades and the what I'd call like the qualifications of the trades. You referenced a drywaller installing windows. I mean, it's really highly contextual, in my opinion. I mean, if you're talking a wood framed window and a carpenter, sure, I'll entertain that. You're talking a aluminum framed glazed system, it's like, no. And particularly in the Midwest region, we can rely to an extent on labor organizations to kind of help provide some guardrails, with respect to appropriate trades installing, their respective materials. But it also requires an understanding and a knowledge of who you're working with. What are their qualifications? We're not interested in their certifications, we're interested in their qualifications.
Yeah. There's so much. I think some people have this sort of what's the opposite? A lack of abundance mindset. I don't know what the antonym of abundance is, but not realizing that there's time and place for each type of system and trade. And as you're saying, if the projects are not a right fit for prefabrication, so be it. There's another project down the street or with a client that's better suited. I think this will be a healthy debate, and I want John to play a little bit of devil's advocate to Dan and hear you two go back and forth. So this discussion about prefabrication or unitizing and the additional dollar spend up front in bringing on a design assist partner or trade like that versus the inherent cost saving or time you could potentially save down the line. Dan, and I don't want to speak for you, but will likely push speed and efficiency, where the end user on the other side of the GC might be saying, well, I could pick apart these components and probably buy out this system for cheaper and install it my way on site. So correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but that's probably what you're typically proposing. And then John, sort of what would be sort of the countering stances to that, and if an argument can be made? Dan, you start on this one.
Oh, I get to go first. Yeah, no, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there, Adrian, of what does the value of prefabrication bring at the beginning of the project? Yes, there is a bigger commitment up front, and even cash flow on the project is different than when you compare it to traditional site-built systems because of the upfront manufacturing that needs to happen for it. So there is an education process with the owners, the architects, and the general contractors to just talk about that. And then, another discussion we typically find ourselves in is first cost versus last cost. What does it mean to spend the money upfront to make a project continue to move forward, and ultimately at the end of the day cost less to operate than it would if it were a different system? So a lot of people get mixed up or gravitate towards, I got proposal A versus proposal B, and that's all I care about, right? So you just need to manage those expectations with those teams and those builders or owners, what have you. And it's a different approach. They have a different product, as John had mentioned, earlier in the conversation here, a developer that's going to build and flip, a developer that's going to build and hold, or higher ed, somebody that's going to hold on to this for 100, many, many years. It's a different approach, and they have different values as it relates to the types of systems that they choose to build their buildings with.
So what am I supposed to do here now?
Well, as I'm listening to Dan say, and I think that was a strong pitch, but I think it's time and place.
Yeah. I think, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I don't want to answer for you either, John, but I do want to hear the backside of some of the, and maybe it doesn't happen at Kraus-Anderson, but it is, some of the things that we just get, sometimes penalized on, or people don't see the value in it, are not recognizing it, is getting beyond just seeing a proposal. They are so ingrained in a hard bid atmosphere. They're just trying to hit a number, and it is what it is. And a challenge that I see with that, and we as trade partners get brought in so much on the back end of like, hey, we have this project. We've been working on it for like 2 or 3 years right now. We can't get it to pencil. Can you help? And then it becomes a different conversation of, yes, we can help. And here's our plan. Here's our approach. But it's just such a waste of time. You hear so many people of saying right now, and this is not just the Midwest, this is across the United States with other people I talked with, like, we have the best set of SD or DD documents of a building, but of a building we can't afford to build. So they have a complete design. They've paid the consultants, the architects, all the way through, but they can't get to that next stage to put a shovel in the ground to actually build it. And so there's a couple challenges, and I think to state our case from a prefabrication standpoint, it's pretty easy to say, hey, you've been trying to make this go for the last 2-3 years and you can't do it, and now you're engaging with us, and we give you a couple ideas, tips, and tricks on how we would approach it, and also now the project's back to life and has a chance of moving ahead.
Yeah, so I guess a couple thoughts. I feel the construction industry is generally slow to change, slow to adopt new concepts and ideas. But in some ways, it's not much more than just telling the story in the way that people can understand it. And the example I'll give is buyout of elevators. Your elevators compared to painting, right? You're prepaying for that elevator package in advance. So your cash flow for that work is happening up front. So how is that really different from prefabricated systems? It's not, right? So part of it is being able to tell that story and say, yes, the cash flow is different and the burn occurs at different times at different rates, but you are used to this when you buy elevators. You are used to this when you buy pre-engineered metal buildings. So, I'd say that's one piece, in terms of pros and cons, the few things that seem to strike a bell with people is really speed to enclosure, right? And up here in the Midwest, particularly during the winter, this affects how efficient and how productive you can be on your interior trades in the dead of winter, in January and February. And so, that is something that oftentimes people struggle to put a value on that, though they inherently understand it's very valuable.
I want to get to performance after, and I'm happy you brought that up in a heating dominated climate and weighing out different unitized systems. But what about the argument to say a general contractor laid out his schedule and roadmap based on a certain way of building, and then a prefabricator like Dan comes in and says, I could slash 3 months off your schedule, your dry-in time. Does that give him an edge if he already has his contract with the owner, or is the general contractor disincentivized to try to save schedule time?
It really depends, honestly. I mean, agreements, will be tied to a milestone schedule. Sometimes there are penalties for not hitting that schedule above and beyond, typical damages. Sometimes there are incentives to finish in advance of that schedule time. I think it really comes down to what the specific negotiation was with that owner contract. After the contract is signed, that would be largely dependent on who is motivated to do what in terms of early completion or original on time completion.
The other point that you brought up that I hadn't really spent much time thinking about is usually when I have this discussion of unitizing and dry-in time, a lot of it is predicated around market and labor rates, and if it's a non-union or union market and labor pool availability and so forth. But I never really had the discussion of weather and how that may impact things, which makes sense. It seems that when you go to the south, unitizing is not as common, whereas when you go to the north, it just has become completely commonplace. So it's interesting how that factors into it. Dan, what have you seen? When you get to the really harsh months, does construction become a major hindrance?
Not for us. One of the things I always tell people is it's always sunny and 75 degrees inside our manufacturing facilities, right? And John and I can attest to this here just as of yesterday. Here we are, end of March, and we just got rocked with a major snowstorm that is disrupted. Unfortunately, we didn't have any winter at all, which is uncommon for our area here. But historically, you can look at what does it mean for us to build in the regions that we build in. Typically come around November, December, and then well into March, April, it's cold weather construction. And cold weather construction is very expensive to the owners as it relates to temp heat, general conditions, site services that are just flat out needed to build in the regions that we are. So when we look at prefabrication, panels that have windows in them, you eliminate a lot of that scope, that additional soft cost, as I would call it, right? It's cost to build, but it's not the cost of the building itself. And with prefabrication, that's where we do see a lot of value, and we do get a lot of credit. And sometimes it's a little bit tough depending on the audience of them saying, hey, we're able to shave 3 months off your enclosures, and oh, by the way, your temp heat bill is going to be reduced by X number of dollars. But the general contractors that are understanding the value of what prefabrication can do for them recognize it, right? How do they get buildings enclosed faster? How do they do more work? And how do they win more work? One of the things that we're seeing a lot of is being engaged before general contractors have projects. They're trying to provide a proposal that sets them apart from their competition, and they are using prefabrication in their responses to their RFPs.
You keep saying, and I think I could guess what it means, but you keep saying this word temp heating savings. To us who don't live in that area, what does that mean?
Well, I'm going to deflect it to John because he's closer to those dollars now than what I am. But John, what do you think on I'm just going to use the example of a mid-rise, or call it a high-rise residential building that's going to build through at least one winter, maybe 2 winters. What do you think an owner spends temp heat per month?
I'm not even going to try to spitball it because it again, I mean, Adrian, you're going to get sick of me saying this. It depends, if it's a traditional steel stud backup assembly with continuous insulation outboard of the gypsum sheathing, the time lag until you get to a thermal control varies, right? If you do, let's just say, for example, you do like a precast sandwich wall panel, you have that thermal control immediately, right? And so the temp heat cost there is driven down quite a bit. If you're basically staggered between the time you start your enclosure and the time you actually have insulation on the wall, it's going to end up being a larger burn rate.
How quickly, Dan, if you're doing traditional precast, not a pre-insulated, infinite facade panel, do you actually apply that insulation to the back face of the precast?
Well, it depends on the scope of the projects. In traditional precast construction, typically, those cladding pieces are non-insulated to begin with, and that insulation scope lives within a different trade partner. But I would say, just based on what I know on a residential build, we may be 3 to 6, I won't say 6, but maybe 3 to 5 stories above the floor of where they're spraying insulation. John, would you agree with that, or is that a little bit aggressive?
No, that I'd say probably 5 is right around there. Yeah.
And would you think that, at that same time that the insulation is happening, that the windows are going in, or do they lag a little bit more?
It can sometimes one will go before the other. It really kind of depends on how the trades have been laid out to begin with.
So other than temp heat, I can guess what it means, I think. But other than temp heat, what would be other variables that would hinder the construction schedule? Obviously, wind is an issue for everybody. So either tower crane or using a spider crane or hanging unitized panels is a problem in any environment. But I'm more so thinking about like sealant application might be an issue. So what are other climate related variables during the winter that hinder typical construction?
Yeah, one that's not even really tied to winter per se, but it's you can't install any moisture sensitive materials within X feet of your slab edge, right? So, you might want to, in general, plumbing and conduit, HVAC runs that can start pretty much independent of enclosure, but you want to start laying sheetrock, blocking, things of that nature. You have to stay off of that perimeter until you are enclosed, because wind-driven rain it's a thing. In terms of winter itself, I don't know if there's as much critical items prior to enclosure on the interior that would otherwise be held up anyways. On the exterior, we're always talking about fill in the blank, 20 degrees and rising, 40 degrees and rising, for whether it be your spray applied air barrier, whether it be your sealants, whether it be your spray foam. Those are the things that cause the pain points. But that's all applied from the exterior typically when we're talking about that, and those things largely go away with the prefabrication.
Yeah, I was Dan, I'm thinking about your panel installation and what would slow that down. I spent a lot of years inspecting curtain wall install back when I had dark hair, and now that I'm on the contracting side, I have gray hair. But I remember in the winter months when you would watch the stack joint seal being applied. A lot of times they'd have a blow dryer or something heating up that substrate or surface so they could apply it, it could cure, and then they could set the next run of panels. But for you, Dan, nothing would really slow you down other than wind from setting, right?
Correct. Yeah, the wind would be the only thing that would limit us in putting panels onto a building. We do not need to seal our panels to continue to erect and put panels on. It's just a matter of making sure that we're able to fly those panels up the building to get them on.
Do you run into trouble with tower crane use and issues on most of your jobs, or is it just because that's something, I'm just trying to think about what we come across in New York and some of your projects. You might I have more space, I would guess, unless it's in an urban environment. But in terms of like tower crane usage, nighttime availability, what are some issues you come across?
Yeah, so it really depends on the type of the build. We're using our prefabricated products on all things that we do build, but when I look specifically to our systems that are pre-insulated or already have the windows into them, those are typically on a vertical build. And vertical build could be a couple story MOB project, or it could be a 20, 30, 40 story high-rise tower. And in both examples there, it is going to come down to space. An application such as an MOB generally has a parking area around it at grade, or there's a standalone structure that might be built at a different time, but would allow for us to bring in our own crane for that and not be tied to having to use a tower crane. When we look at the dense urban downtown residential towers that are being built, they do lend themselves to the crane. And it becomes more of a coordination effort that happens between the general contractor and the concrete crew. And what we will do is heavily rely on the superintendents and the foremans to pull together, pull schedules to say, hey, when does it make sense to bring in the prefabricator and work second shift when needed? And one of the unique things that we always find ourselves into is comparing that cycle time. What does it mean to build the superstructure? And what does it mean to enclose that floor? And generally, depending on where you're at in the country, it is anywhere from, I'm going to say, 2 to 4 times faster to enclose it with prefabrication versus how long it's going to take them to build a floor at a time. So we will find ourselves saying, hey, we're going to come and we're going to work 4 nights, or we're going to work whatever it is, an abbreviated schedule, while we're on second shift until the building's topped out, and then we switch to day shift and then get the rest of the building enclosed for it. So it's back and forth. And really the short answer is it depends on the project. We'd love to bring in our own crane, but we also work nice with tower cranes as well.
I'm thinking back to the project we walked across the street from the Twins stadium, which you both worked
North
on.
Loop Green.
And when I went there, I was running out of panic from the winter month. That was right before I flew out because we had sheet ice coming in, and I was worried about not making it out alive of the airport. So it was that time of year, I'll say that. But in talking about different system types, especially in a heating dominated climate where it seems like you are very attuned to things like condensation resistance and thermal bridging and so forth, weighing out like a hand-laid brick versus EFIS system versus precast versus curtain wall. Let's not really think about rain, because I think in a very wet environment, someone might be worried about EFIS and might be more in accustomed or driven to want to go to a precast solution. But in a very cold environment, are you running up against any issues with unitized curtain wall or window wall? Interestingly, that's a job where you had a little bit of both. So John, do you see any issues right now with the aluminum fenestration industry, or are both really able to kind of meet the code standard at the moment?
Yes and no. I'd say first and foremost, if the architect doesn't specify an appropriate system to begin with, then you're already set back, right? You need a system that is going to give you the appropriate CRF for the unit, and then you need to have thermal modeling run at your interfaces, and so having an architect that understands what is needed to provide that performance in terms of condensation resistance. That's a huge first step in the right direction. And then I'd say the second step is really it's focusing on those interfaces and focusing on the transitions between your exterior wall assembly materials, because really the condensation shows up at your points where your thermal gradient abruptly shifts or abruptly changes. So it's really, there are products and there are systems out there that can rise to the occasion, but you need to actually be using them.
Yeah, it's not, well, I think in some markets, I talk a lot about this in a Boston and Seattle, it's not the actual sections of the curtain wall or window wall or the center of glass performance. It's at all your transition areas, whether it's your opaque to glazing area or your receptors or your tiles or whatever it might be. And that's where the big problem areas are. And that's where the major thermal bridging happens at your, cantilever balconies, at your terrace doors, and so forth. So it sounds like as a group, you guys are very sort of progressed in doing that actual as-built modeling and studying where those problem areas are and getting ahead of them early.
Yeah, we try to, best first case scenario is getting the architect to write a specification that actually says the provider of the frame fenestration needs to generate thermal models. And lacking that, if you don't get that, then writing that into the subcontractor's scope of work, say above and beyond what the spec is saying, we want you to generate thermal models for these conditions. Because we call it, maybe this is just me, I call it the witching hour. January 15th to February 15th is when we get the calls from clients saying, there's a line of frost growing at the bottom of my frame, or there's fog on my window, or whatever the case may be. And you don't want to be in those situations. Trust me.
Yeah, and the other discussion point that I hear coming up a lot is, especially as we're seeing like conversion of use, the conversion of the use of the building type, whether it's conversion from office to residential or hotel or mixed use or whatever it might be, the deconstructibility of systems and thinking about how at the end of the useful service life of certain components, you'll be able to maintain them. So I don't know, Dan, at your panel, you can go around and you can recaulk the panel interfaces every 25, 30, 40 years. At your punched window opening, maybe you can replace the glass from the inside. And so thinking about all the individual components and over the 100-year lifespan, how you'll able to upkeep the system, not only from a holistic standpoint, but each individual component. And it seems 20, 30, 40 years ago, we weren't really designing with that mentality in mind.
Yeah, I think so. It's as it relates to the systems that we do and the access that we have to the areas that do require maintenance, it's quite easy to achieve and not as disruptive to the end user as compared to a site-built system, and what needs to happen if something were to go sideways on such a project or just general maintenance is needed. One of the things that we, not only the way that we manufacture and build our buildings, another service or part of our organization is our restoration group that we do have, and the warranties and service providing contracts that we do put into place after a building is built, and making sure the owners are educated in what they need to do. Some of the buildings that we built, and John can attest to this too, is some of the buildings that we build for are one-time builders. It could be a K-12 building that passes a bond referendum once every 50 years. And that group that takes care of the building may or may not be there when it comes time to doing some of the maintenance. And then on the flip side, we're building with people that build all day, every day, every single year. And they have an understanding of what does it take for the maintenance of it and what systems are easier to maintain versus other systems that are out there.
Yeah, I would just pile on there, that a component of this, which is it's an aspiration, is really getting the end user's expectations of operations and maintenance of that delivered project. You know, my super silly example is, you know, if you run your glazing all the way down to grade, and then you have landscaping directly adjacent on the exterior, and every time it rains, it kicks up mulch onto the glass. You know, it's it's a dumb example, but it's like, okay, is this something you want to talk about with the end user? Do they want to have to go back after every rainstorm and, you know, pick pieces of mulch off of their IGUs?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you've seen this, Dan, a lot, but the other example is like having a drip edge at the edge of the precast. And if you eliminate that or skip it, how often do you want to go out there and clean your glass?
Well, and it's, you know, that is such a simple yet overlooked detail that is very much easy to achieve in precast. It's a part of the manufacturing process. It is a standard detail in our book, and there's oftentimes where we run across documents that don't call for it, or not asking for it, or not showing it. And you know, those are some of the simple coordination things where John and I cross paths related to drips, integral drips. John, I think one of your other favorite topics is high-low roof conditions. What happens when you have a low roof coming into a higher wall condition, and really, you know, making sure that you're doing your part from a design standpoint that is, you know, very easy to incorporate up front, but takes a major lift to fix if it were missed after the fact.
Agreed. All right. I want to ask both of you as a closing note, as building science and prefabrication fans or advocates call it. I think we live in this world or this bubble where we think we all talk about it and get excited about it and spread awareness. But I always think we could do a better job of spreading greater awareness within our subset of the industry, but also outside. Getting more architects, getting owners to care about it and getting engaged in it. So I guess I'll ask you, do you think we're trending in the right direction? And what do you think we can do to do a better job of spreading the word?
Well, I'll take a first stab. I mean, I think it does come back to having the right people plugged in, the right place at the right time. You know, no one party or individual is going to be infallible in making sure that the optimal decisions, you know, are really considered and made. You know, I had a situation yesterday where I realized there was an opportunity to consider an alternate, but it was after the fact, and it's like, you know, it does no good looking back and saying, oh, I wished we would have, you know, we would have investigated and studied X instead of Y. So it's really about having those people at the table, you know, and really it's, are we getting better? In my mind, there are pockets and there are, you know, segments that are getting better. As a whole, I think the entire construction industry is so, I don't know, I don't even know what the right word is. It's so bifurcated. You know, you're gonna have parties and players out there that are always going to be doing, you know, less optimal things. And then you're always going to have people who want to learn from past lessons and want to do it better the next time. And part of that doing it better the next time is having the right people engaged when they should be engaged.
Yeah, and I'll just echo John here a little bit. You know, are we trending in the right direction as prefabricators? Yes, we are. I think as you compare some of our first discussions, Adrian, whether it's you and I, our first discussions compared to where we're at today, or John, even some of our early conversations and what we have done together to make sure that, you know, we are checking the box and you know, crossing our T's, dotting our I's. You will see more and more prefabrication, whether it is a prefab wall, modular construction. There's more and more of it being discussed, and people are finding different ways to incorporate prefabrication. It could be, you know, bathroom pods. It could be, you know, the electrical for any sorts of projects. But, you know, we've been doing prefabrication for 70 years. We continue to advance. What it was for us 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago is very much different than what it is today. And the big thing I think we need to do as a group is to make sure that we are educating owners and architects and consultants and builders out there that, hey, this technology is out there. This is what it means for us. And I think one of the punchline, and John was kind of hitting on this a little bit, is that there are going to be other prefabricators out there that are offering products that aren't right for certain applications. And being able to raise your hand and have a seat at the table and say, hey, I understand what you're trying to do here. My product is really good at this. What you're trying to do is outside of that limitation. So we may or may not be interested, depending on what it is. And you have to be smart about it, and you have to be honest and transparent about when it works and when it doesn't work. So just be aware of other prefabricators that are coming about. When something new comes, or it's the flavor of the month, you will see a bunch of new people. And just you need to have the experts in place and the people that are asking for the right questions and the right information to make sure that it is the right product for their building.
Yeah, we need to go more on the flavor of the century or flavor of the decade.
Yeah, I would just, maybe this is a tangent, but I would just kind of riff off of that. Parties out there offering products, and I think I recognize, with a background in structural engineering, that traditional precasters are extremely well suited to be moving the ball forward in this field. If you take a look at a metal panel outfit or a glazer wanting to move into mega panels or wanting to move into more unitized opaque wall, they're basically taking an exterior wall system, starting from a point of maybe it weighs 7 PSF. And as they're accommodating these heavier loads because their panels are getting larger, they're kind of not used to dealing with extremely heavy point loads onto slabs. The precasters have been doing that forever. You want to support 8 or 9 kips off of a slab edge. The precasters have been doing that all day, all night. Whereas, maybe some of the other panelizers and prefabricators, it's a stretch for them.
Dan, I think I just got you a testimonial. All right. Thanks,
I mean, I can't echo it enough of how often I see somebody that is starting to use the word prefabrication and what does it mean. It's interesting to see what it is, and in certain areas of the country are going to, there's going to be mistakes that are made, unfortunately, and that's the challenge. But that's what happens when you have something new. And the good thing we have as our regions here, we're major on risk mitigation and slow to change. So we will get there eventually, but it might take some time, and that's okay. Because we want to make sure we're doing what's right. So.
All right, guys, this was a lot of fun. Thank you for having on.
Yeah, no, it's been great.
Appreciate you setting this up. I didn't think we'd go 55 minutes, to be honest with you.
It was pretty good. I had to cut you guys off early.
There we go. Round 2 coming up.